It's the third year of my secret relationship with Richard. And he still refuses to go public. At a party, someone teased him about me. Richard on me. Celeste is so beautiful. After all these years, you really haven't been moved. I watched him clinking glasses with others, my heart secretly hoping. He leaned back in his chair and casually said, "Stop joking around. Celeste and I are just good friends." I was stunned by his words, suddenly feeling quite disheartened. Yes, we're just ordinary friends. After I said this, Richard seemed to glance at me. The atmosphere froze for a few seconds. Someone quickly tried to smooth things over. "Well, that's good. A buddy of mine is interested in Celeste. Celeste, can I give you his business card?" I hadn't responded yet when Richard suddenly put down his drink, stood up, and walked over to the back of my chair. He put his arm around me and gave a look to the person who spoke. "That's right. I only have this one good friend. She's a really nice girl, very pure. Don't let your unscrupulous friends mess her up." I pushed Richard's hand away and looked at the slightly awkward friends around us. "You can give me the card. Just consider it meeting a new friend." My friend hurriedly handed me the card. I accepted it and looked up to find Richard's half-smiling, half-mocking eyes. A dull ache throbbed in my heart. I instinctively wanted to leave, but Richard stopped me. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera. "Celeste, look at the camera." The camera captured our faces, his handsome and charming, mine a bit pale with a hollow look in my eyes. After taking the picture, he immediately posted it on social media with the caption, "Long live friendship." I suddenly felt completely disheartened. It was the third year of my relationship with Richard, but only we knew about it. After leaving the restroom, I stood in front of the mirror and opened that social media post, commenting, "Long live friendship." Before leaving early, Richard called to ask where I had gone. I said I wasn't feeling well, and he didn't ask further. He told me to get some rest and ended the call. I didn't go back to my rented place but headed to Richard's house. Occasionally, I would stay over at his place, but none of my things were in the living room or other public areas. My belongings were all kept in the master bedroom. Richard was unwilling to make our relationship public. He didn't want our private feelings to be open to public scrutiny. His reason was always very grandiose: "If you can accept it, then we'll be together." In reality, even if he didn't give me a reason, it seemed I couldn't refuse. After all, I owed Richard's family a huge favor. Looking back now, it wasn't his private feelings he wanted to keep hidden, it was me. "Celeste." I unlocked the door with my fingerprint and went straight to the master bedroom. But as I passed the living room, I inadvertently saw a strawberry bear plush toy on the sofa. It was the toy I had bought. Such a childish thing clearly wasn't Richard's either. Suddenly, I understood. That social media post from tonight. He must have posted it for some girl. Yet, surprisingly, I didn't feel too heartbroken. After packing up my things from the master bedroom, I took off the necklace I had worn for 3 years. The pendant was a ring Richard gave me, but for 3 years, I had never worn it openly. Since it was an out-of-place item, there was no need to keep it. On the third day in the harbor city, Richard called me. I didn't answer. About half an hour later, he sent a message saying, "I'll keep the ring for 3 days." I understood what he meant. We used to have disagreements occasionally, and he would always handle them coldly. In the end, I would slowly digest it myself. Over the years, from college to the working world, I silently followed his path. I never thought of giving up before. But now, I was truly exhausted. I replied, "No need to keep it. Just throw it away." Richard didn't reply to any more messages. I stared at my phone screen for a while and then blocked his number. Richard's face was not pleased. He poured another glass of wine and downed it in one gulp. Hearing someone mention her, "My buddy seems to be serious. He even called me in the middle of the night last night, saying he really likes her." Richard suddenly slammed the wine glass down and stood up, his face as cold as frost. The girl beside him looked a bit frightened. She called out softly, But Richard seemed not to hear. He didn't give her a glance. The girl, feeling aggrieved, hurried to catch up with him. Can I come with you? I don't want to stay here. Richard held her wrist tightly and pushed her away. If you don't want to stay, then don't ever come back. He opened the door and strode out. The emotions pent up in his chest seemed to surge and almost burst out. He continued down to the elevator and went to the first floor. Once he got into the car, the roar of the engine helped him regain some sanity. What was he going to do? Where was he going? He knew she had taken all her belongings from the house. He knew she was now in the harbor city. Richard suddenly slammed his fist on the steering wheel. The horn blared, piercing through the dark night. The phone suddenly rang abruptly. He swiped to answer it. His mother's voice, as elegant as ever, said, "Richard just abandoned me. When are you coming home? Bring Celeste with you. I don't think I can make it in the next few days." "What's the matter?" "Celeste and I had a bit of an argument. She won't talk to me and even blocked me." His mother laughed at his nonchalant tone. "All right. I'll give her a call. But why did you upset Celeste? She's so hot-tempered?" Richard played with the lighter in his hand and smiled. "How would I know?" After ending the call, he threw his phone into the storage box, only to see the necklace Celeste had left at his house. The pendant was a diamond ring, but the diamond was a bit small. Richard thought, her birthday was coming up. Perhaps he should buy a bigger diamond ring for her, then publicly acknowledge their relationship and propose. Royce came back to the hotel with several paper bags. I was sitting on the terrace wrapped in a light, soft cashmere blanket, staring into space. He handed me a hot drink with a straw. I took the milk tea, thanked him, and instinctively looked up at him. The harbor city was rainy today, with a sudden drop in temperature. Royce had only worn a thin windbreaker, and his ears were slightly red from the cold. "Have some too. To warm up?" "Okay." He agreed but didn't take the hot drink. Instead, he hugged me from behind. I sipped the milk tea slowly. Royce lowered his head and kissed my ear, which felt a bit ticklish, so I turned my face to avoid it. But Royce's kiss soon moved to my lips. His laughter mingled with the kiss on my lips. "Aren't you going to drink as well?" I instinctively opened my mouth to retort. But before I could say a word, he kissed me deeply. The milk teacup fell aside, and the carpet became soaked. His clothes were stained with deep water marks. Outside the window was gloomy rain and mist. Inside the room, however, was filled with a warm, spring-like atmosphere. I felt uneasy about meeting his gaze, feeling his eyes were too intense. He had always been so self-restrained, yet now his gaze was filled with desire. I turned my head and buried my face in his shoulder. "Seeing me shy?" Royce's voice was rough but also smiling. He held me tighter, but his kisses grew even more tender. In a daze, I saw overlapping shadows on the glass, swaying and blurring. It took a long time for everything to calm down. After Royce came out of the shower, he saw me lounging lazily against the headboard. He helped me get washed up and then put on a bathrobe. While drying my hair, some strands fell behind my ears, and I instinctively reached up to tuck them back. But Royce was ahead of me, already placing the hair back behind my ears. "Thank you, but I thank you," I said softly again. Royce seemed somewhat resigned. "Celeste, are you going to keep being so polite with me?" I didn't know how to respond. Even though we had been reckless once more, it still felt unreal, like a dream. The sweet aroma of milk tea lingered on my lips, and I felt as if I had returned to that winter night many years ago. The tutoring session had ended, and it was already very late. The streets were long, dark, and sparsely populated. Royce happened to pass by. "Hi, Celeste. What a coincidence," he said, standing at the crossroad in a black coat, smiling faintly. He had always been serious and unsmiling at school, so I was caught off guard by his sudden smile. That night, he took me home. On the way, we shared a baked sweet potato. The wind was strong, and it was snowing. He stood in the wind, shielding me from the snow. When he lowered his head, his forehead lightly touched mine, but I quickly pulled away. At that moment, my heart was slightly trembling. I thought this was the beginning of a sweet, naive romance. Little did I know, fate had arranged merely a fleeting encounter. Whether it was years ago or now, the same pattern seemed to repeat. 15 minutes ago, when Royce went to the bathroom to shower, I received a call from my mom. She wanted me to return to the Zhu family home for dinner with Richard. Initially, I declined, but my mom said Richard's father was also there. He rarely came back and wanted to see me. When she mentioned Richard's father, I couldn't help but tremble with anxiety, like a guilty criminal, restless and shivering. Even after the call ended, I couldn't calm down. That year, when my feelings for Royce were just beginning to blossom, a phone call from my mom completely changed my life. It also extinguished those budding feelings before they could even grow. Now, fates will have turned again, mocking me as if it were a cruel joke. I felt like a pitiful coward, unable to let Royce see the dark and shameful past. Royce, I took a deep breath, trying to sound casual and relaxed. Restaurant? He asked. I'm going back to Beijing. Tonight's flight. My hands, hidden under the blanket, were unknowingly clasped together tightly. My right thumb unconsciously scratched an old scar on my ring finger. It was a sharp pain, almost like I was scratching it open, but I couldn't stop. I just smiled at Royce and said, "Let's not keep in touch after this. We've had a mutual understanding these past few days, so no one owes anyone anything. Let's just pretend nothing ever happened." With that, I stood up and walked towards the room, fearing that if I stayed even a second longer, my tears would betray me. But Riz tightly grasped my wrist. "Celeste, Adron, tell me, okay?" I couldn't bring myself to say it. How could I explain it? My mother, when she worked for the Zhu family, seduced Richard's father. She was caught by a Zhu family driver, who then blackmailed her into having an affair with him. After she refused, the driver, humiliated, lost control while drunk and killed her in a car accident. Richard's parents nearly divorced over it. I became an orphan. But my mother, despite everything, took me in and supported me through college. The lawyer who handled her case was also the one who helped convict the driver of intentional murder. Her grace, despite the grudge in me, was an immense favor to the young me. At that time, Richard didn't hold my family's past against me. On the contrary, he was always very kind to me. Without these 3 years of clandestine love, perhaps we could have been friends for a lifetime. But sadly, no one can go back. I pulled away from Royce's grasp. I could feel his gaze burning with pain, enveloping me completely. Yet I still didn't have the courage to look at him. No, nothing happened. I just need to go back. Go back where? Royce pressed my shoulder gently, but his hand slid down my arms and finally wrapped around me tightly. He buried his face in my neck. Don't go back, Celeste. He's not good for you. Royce held me so tightly, it felt like he wanted to merge me with him. Don't go back to him. Even if it's not me. Don't let it be him. My tears fell down on Nay, silently soaking his shirt. I didn't know how to explain. Richard and I were impossible. The grudges with his family could never be untangled. I didn't want to hurt Royce, and I deeply resisted him knowing all that had happened to me. It was too awful and too hard to talk about. It was getting late, and I needed to catch my flight. I grasped his arm and gently pushed him away. His eyes were red, and mine were also filled with tears. But I managed to smile. "Royce, take care of yourself." He didn't say anything, just gently wiped the tears from the corner of my eyes. "If you're unhappy when you get home, let me know any time." I nodded vigorously. I wanted to smile at him again, but the tears just wouldn't stop. The winter at home was very cold. As soon as I got off the plane, I shivered and quickly wrapped my coat tighter. As I walked with the crowd, I spotted Richard immediately among the people waiting for the flight. He was tall, and his face was strikingly handsome, making it hard not to notice him. "Mom asked me to pick you up," he said, coming over and grabbing my suitcase before turning to walk away. After a few steps, he looked back and curtly added, It's not like I wanted to come. I smiled faintly, showing no extra emotion. Thank you. Richard seemed to grind his teeth and then turned away, striding with long legs and a determined pace. I didn't speed up but maintained my own pace, walking slowly forward. When we reached the car, he had already placed the luggage in the trunk, standing by the front passenger seat. He glanced at me impatiently. Don't dawdle. I have things to do tonight. I didn't go to the front seat but opened the rear door. Richard's face was darker than the Beijing sky at that moment. I calmly looked at him. Isn't the front seat reserved for girlfriends? He seemed to be enraged and slammed the door shut. You really know how to stir things up. Fine. Sit wherever you want. The ride was silent. When we arrived at his house, I glanced at the brightly lit main building, feeling a weight of indescribable heaviness in my legs. Richard also stopped, looking down at me from above. What are you afraid of? He's not going to eat you? I'm not afraid. Just unsure how to face it. I'm embarrassed to face it. All right, he'll leave early, and you can come with me, Richard said as he walked forward. I stayed where I was, not moving. He turned back with irritation. What are you standing there for, Celeste? Come on. He waved at me in a familiar gesture, reminiscent of the countless times he had waited for me to finish school. Suddenly, I felt a release, letting go of many things. Perhaps being ordinary friends isn't so bad after all. I smiled at Richard. I'm coming. He looked momentarily stunned and then gave me a strange look. But his pace slowed down. The dinner was calm. Richard's father had been unwell for the past 2 years and wanted to stay home for a long time. My mom was indifferent about it. Their marital relationship had reached a freezing point over the years. There was almost no conversation at the table. And no arguments either. This was the heaviest burden on my heart. After the meal, Richard's father called him to the study. But within half an hour, Richard stormed downstairs angrily and dragged me out. As we were leaving, I couldn't help but look back. In the lamplight, my mom's solemn and expressionless face made my heart tremble unexpectedly. I had lived with her family for a long time and had seen her often, but this was the first time I saw such a chilling expression on her usually kind face. But I had no time to think further as Richard had already dragged me into the car. He seemed inexplicably furious, driving aggressively back home. When we arrived downstairs, he coldly told me to go up. I'm moving out of this house and never coming back. Just like our scandalous affair. I don't want it anymore. I will never go back. Celeste, get out of the car. I'm not going up with you. I took out my iPhone, unlocked the screen, and calmly looked at him standing outside the car door. If you force me, I'll call the police. And call the police. Ask them if it's illegal for a boyfriend to bring his girlfriend home. Richard, bandimne. We've broken up. I never said we broke up. Is it even interesting to talk about this now? I find it funny. Yet I'm too exhausted to laugh. Richard, I don't want to argue with you. I'm tired and want to go back to sleep. Didn't you say you had plans tonight at the airport? Go handle your business. I'll just take a cab back. Richard stood outside the car, the deep night cloaking him. After a while, he unusually compromised. I'll take you home. If you refuse again, don't even think about going back tonight. Celeste. I chose to remain silent. Richard has a deeply stubborn side. Arguing with him doesn't do me any good. When the car reached my apartment building, I thanked him and tried to get out. But Richard turned around and called out to me. Your birthday is in a few days. Let's have a proper breakup then. I don't think it's necessary to do it now. It's better to part ways calmly. We can still be comfortable around our mutual friends. My parents said we should celebrate properly while we're still at home. You wouldn't want to refuse a favor from your benefactor, would you? With Richard saying that, I had no reason to refuse. Fine. Do whatever you want. I opened the car door and got out. Richard didn't linger and immediately turned the car around and left. The winter night was very cold, but after walking a few steps, I was completely chilled by the wind. I lowered my head, tightened my coat, and quickened my pace towards the building. As I approached the entrance, I suddenly saw I suddenly saw, in the shadow of a tree, an orange streetlight white casting a long silhouette. Royce, in a thin trench coat, was standing in the cold Beijing night. I don't know how long he had been standing there. I stopped in my tracks, staring at him. Royce, as he walked towards me. The first snow of Beijing began to fall. Snowflakes landed on his hair, his shoulders. But he didn't mind. He simply brushed the snowflakes from my bangs. Time seemed to roar back to that winter years ago. And Royce, surprisingly, took out a warm roasted sweet potato from his pocket. He broke it in half and handed me one piece. I took it, stunned, until the sweet aroma spread on my tongue. Tears unexpectedly fell. He lowered his head, his forehead occasionally touching mine. We stood there foolishly in the first snow of Beijing, eating that roasted sweet potato. Celeste, he said. His long fingers brushed a small black smudge from the corner of my lips. What should I do? My family kicked me out. But why? My parents said no man in the family has ever been irresponsible. So, as an anomaly, I have nowhere to go. He was smiling, but his eyes lacked to joy. I felt a slight pain in my heart. The soreness spread instantly. Maybe the snow was getting heavier. So my vision blurred. But Royce, I don't need you to take responsibility. Also, it's not my first time dating. Suddenly, Royce's kiss enveloped me. His lips were cold, probably from the snowflakes melting on them. But that kiss was burning hot, almost melting me into snow water. Celeste, you know, I like you. I don't care about that. He held my face and kissed away my tears. Tonight, I'm betting with myself. If you don't come back, I'll try to convince myself to give up and not bother you again. But if you come back, then this time, no matter what, I won't let go. His gaze was intense, yet there was a hint of joy in his eyes. I was soft-hearted and found it hard to resist. Still at the doorway, Chris kissed me again. As he helped me remove my coat and scarf, he clasped my waist and pulled me into his embrace. Our bodies pressed tightly together, and I noticed his impatience, which was unusual for him. Royce, you seem anxious, I said. His long fingers lifted the hem of my cashmere sweaters. His slightly rough fingertips caressed the soft flesh of my side. His hot palm gripped my waist, pressing me back into his embrace. His kiss was intense and deep. I closed my eyes, tiptoeing to meet him. Don't rush. Royce, we have the whole night ahead of us. He looked down at me and smiled. It was the first time I saw genuine joy in his eyes since we met. Bryce held my hand and let it fall down. Celeste, we agreed on the whole night. Not a second less. That night, the snow fell all night. The snow also melted all night. Richard is the epitome of a wealthy playboy. His daily life is full of excess, surrounded by friends, never lonely or bored. But these days, he often feels that time is moving too slowly. The pleasures he used to indulge in now seem tasteless. In the top floor room of the club, while friends were playing cards and billiards in a lively chaos, he felt an intense boredom and impatience. Richard tossed the cue stick, took his phone, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. As he unlocked the screen, a WeChat message came in. It was a few blurry photos. The background was a busy supermarket. The couple in front of the shelves was smiling at each other. In one photo, Bryce had his arm around her waist, and she didn't seem to resist at all. Richard's eyes tightened. If the previous photo of their interlocked hands hadn't fazed him, his photos made a deep impression on him. As a man with experience, he could see at a glance that they had a substantive relationship and it wasn't a one-time thing. Richard saw his own red eyes and the almost twisted face in the floor-to-ceiling window. He struggled to control himself but still cowed and held back. He threw his phone to the ground, shattering it in two pieces. The lively atmosphere abruptly stopped. Everyone looked at him with surprise and fear. But Richard forced himself to calm down. He turned to the crowd with a composed expression and voice continued playing. Don't stop. He then stepped outside. They'll be back later. Don't wait for me. Outside the room, the hallway was empty. Richard walked forward until he saw a waiter. "Give me your phone." He reached out, and the waiter, unsure, handed him the phone respectfully. Richard dialed Celeste's number. When did her number become so familiar? He couldn't remember. But that wasn't important. He needed to hear her voice. He needed to see her. He needed to take her away from Royce, that man who could lure her away with just a roasted sweet potato. But when Celeste heard his voice, she hung up immediately. When he called back, she wouldn't answer. Richard lit a cigarette, biting it between his lips. He sent Celeste a message to force me to come find you directly. On the third call, she obediently answered. She must be avoiding Royce, afraid he would hear. Her voice sounded guilty, like a thief. Richard felt his heart racing, blood boiling, burning him inside out. "Celeste, tell Royce that you were just impulsive and playing around. You don't really like him, and you never could. Tell him to go back abroad. I'll pretend nothing happened. This forgiveness is a one-time deal." There was half a minute of silence on the other end of the line. Richard heard his own breathing and even his heartbeat. Those seconds felt like suffocation. Maybe that night in Hong Kong was an impulse. But now, it wasn't. I liked him in high school. It's normal to still like him now. And Richard, we're just friends. Friends have no right to interfere in each other's choice of partners. When we were together, I never got your acknowledgement. Now that I'm with someone else, what I do doesn't need your forgiveness. Richard, move on and let's part on good terms. After she finished speaking, she hung up again before he could respond. Richard clutched his phone, reluctant to put it down. Outside the window, heavy snow fell. It was the same kind of snowfall from last year. At that time, Celeste was at his house, and they cooked hot pot together. Afterward, she snuggled on the sofa watching TV. He slept with his head resting on her lap. Just as he was about to fall asleep, she seemed to kiss him secretly. He pretended not to notice, but inside, he felt a sweet stir. Celeste, like her mother, I see me please not abandon me, was beautiful. The kind that every man would like and want to marry. At that time, he was uncontrollably drawn to her while also disapproving of her background and past. So, from the beginning, he told her that he wouldn't make the relationship public and couldn't. He didn't want his friends to tease him privately. Celeste's mom hooked his dad, and Celeste hooked him, to him. Falling for these two was something to be proud of. He liked her, occasionally obsessively, but he also told himself that he could never marry her. He thought he had everything under control. After all, his family had done too much for her. That's why she always obeyed him, and was well behaved. 3 years passed, and he almost forgot. Celeste used to be straightforward and lively, able to let go easily. She didn't want to abandon him anymore, decisively and without leaving a way back. Just as he wished. They were only friends. They would be friends for life. Richard, thinking of this, suddenly took out the velvet box he always carried. The 11.8-carat diamond ring was meant to be given to her on her birthday tomorrow. But now know me. It sparkled mockingly in the box. Richard handed the phone and the box to the waiter. "Thank you for letting me use your phone. I don't need this ring anymore. So, it's yours?" His tone was unusually calm and gentle. The waiter was shocked and tried to refuse, but he had already turned and left. On my birthday, I had plans with Royce. After I came back from the zoo family, we would celebrate alone. Just the two of us. He sent me offering the black cashmere coat I bought him. Looking especially handsome, seeing him a bit reluctant and sad. I tiptoed and gave him a light kiss. "Wait for me at home. We'll have hot pot." Royce nodded and gave me a gentle kiss before my car from the zoo family arrived. We parted reluctantly. As the car drove away, Royce stood by the roadside, the heavy snow covering the entire city. I watched him from the car window until he disappeared from sight, then withdrew my gaze. At Richard's house, the birthday party he arranged, he didn't come. He had said he wanted to break up on my birthday. Now O's not abandon me. It was unnecessary. The things I said on the phone that day, With his pride, he would never lower himself again. This was fine on me. Like the wind that leaves no trace, we returned to being true friends. When I got out of the car, I felt something was off. It was very quiet, and even the servants were scarce. I felt a vague fear. Somehow, it reminded me of my mother's terrifyingly gloomy face that day. I stopped, took out my phone, and called Royce. I let it ring 3 times and hung up. This was a scene from a drama we watched together recently. 3 rings and hang up indicate an uncertain situation or hidden danger. Royce didn't understand and come immediately. The servant dropped me off at the main building and then left. My mother, as not her mother, dressed in a frost-colored standing collar kipo, was sitting on the sofa. When she saw me, she smiled and waved me over to have some tea. Her dignified and graceful face still looked kind and gentle. I even started to doubt whether I was being too sensitive or if I had misjudged the situation that day. Come, Celeste, have a cup of tea with me. But tea, a clear jade color, rippled slightly with a fragrant aroma. I picked up the cup and took small sips, but then my mother suddenly stood up. I almost forgot to get the gift I prepared for you. Wait for me a moment. You'll go upstairs to get it. I quickly followed her but felt a sudden dizziness. My mother hurriedly supported me. Celeste. What's wrong? You look pale. Let me help you to the room to rest. It's the same room you stayed in before. It's always been cleaned. I cowed and opened my eyes, and my body felt weak. In my dazed state, I felt like someone else was supporting me. I tried to open my eyes to see who it was, but my vision remained blurry, until a familiar voice suddenly sounded. Celeste, you're even more beautiful than your mother was when she was young. Is that Richard's father? I was struck as if by lightning. But that brief moment of clarity was soon swallowed by the effects of the drug. Then came a whirlwind of confusion, and I was heavily pushed onto the bed. The bedroom door was closed. Richard's mother stood downstairs with her back straight, staring fixedly at the closed door. Many years ago, Richard's mother had also been in this room. Screaming, crying, begging for help, she pleaded for a bit of kindness to save her, but in the end, she didn't go upstairs. Suddenly, the harsh screeching of brakes echoed in the courtyard. Repeatedly, Richard's mother was abruptly awakened and turned around in shock. Royce and Richard almost simultaneously burst through the door and rushed upstairs. The bedroom door was smashed open. Richard's father fell from the bed in fear, disheveled and injured. When the door opened, Richard suddenly stopped in his tracks. Royce, take her to the hospital. He stood outside the door, turning sideways, not looking inside. Royce, though surprised, didn't stop. He quickly carried Celeste out. She was still unconscious, and Royce wrapped her tightly in his coat. Richard glanced at her once and then turned away. Celeste's hand hung limply from the coat. He saw the old injury on her ring finger, but there were also new, mottled wounds. Even one of her fingernails was broken and bleeding. He couldn't bring himself to look a second time. The house was very quiet. It was a deathly silence, as if every honest heart was tightly bound with dense threads. Richard didn't know how he made it downstairs. His mother called his name several times, but he seemed not to hear. He walked through the living room and out into the garden, like a walking corpse. The snow, as big as goose feathers, swallowed the entire world. Richard stood there, not knowing how long he had been standing. Until his knees gave way, he collapsed into the snow. It turned out that what he despised was indeed deserving of disdain. What he looked down upon was himself. The disgraceful one was not Celeste, but himself and the whole family. He should be grateful now that, in the eyes of the world, she had never been with someone like him, because even he found himself disgusting with such blood flowing through him. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital, with Royce by my bedside. As soon as he saw me open my eyes, his bloodshot eyes immediately brightened. Celeste, you're awake. I nodded lightly, feeling a pain in my throat, as if I had swallowed a lump of charcoal. Do you want some water? Royce quickly got up, prepared some warm honey water, and brought it to the bedside. He then picked me up and held me in his arms, feeding me the water. I'll give you some porridge later. Royce touched my forehead and naturally bent down to kiss me. I instinctively looked at him. Before I could ask, he seemed to know what I wanted to know. Nothing happened. Don't worry. After a pause, he added, actually, I should thank Richard. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't have gotten there so quickly. I leaned into his embrace, slowly turning my face to look out the window. Is it still snowing? The snow has stopped. It should be clear tomorrow. Celeste. From now on, every day will be clear. Everything has settled. All those who deserved punishment have been justly and ruthlessly judged by the law. My worries can finally be laid to rest. Royce took me to visit my mother. Her previous grave was in the most remote corner of the cemetery. Because she had lived disgracefully and died so tragically, that grave was purchased by my mother herself. I was very grateful back then. But now, looking back, it's deeply regrettable. I moved my mother's ashes from that cemetery. Royce bought a new grave site. On my mother's birthday, we moved her there. It has green mountains and rivers, with green trees swaying and fields of flowers. My mother would surely like it. I knelt in front of her grave for a long time, confessing my wrongs, for resenting her when I was young, for hating her in my heart. I don't know how long I knelt. Royce knelt beside me for as long as I did. At first, I cried, but later, I hugged my mother's gravestone and smiled. The person beside me is Royce. He really likes me and treats me very well. If you can see from my afterlife, you can rest assured. Royce held my hand. He spoke very earnestly. Auntie, I don't just like her a lot. The wind blew, and the spring grass swayed like wave. I love her very much. My heart felt like it was being brushed by soft feathers. It was both sweet and sour but expanding with strands of sweetness. I looked up at him and smiled through tears. I told him I had just made a wish in front of my mother. He held me, asking softly, what did you wish for? I smiled lightly. Of course. I can't tell. If I say it, it won't come true. Royce held me tighter and tighter. His lips and eyes were filled with a smile, growing deeper and more tender. He must have been thinking about that night in Hong Kong, the moonlight of that night. And that night was him. That night he posted on social media. Now prize no abandon me. As I am by his side, I also gently say it out loud.